I'm Julie Wolf with IndieBio, and I'm joined today by Kai Linton. Kai is the CEO of Multus Media, a company working to make cultivated meat completely animal-free. Kai, I'd love to talk about Multus Media, but I think first we should set some parameters around what exactly cultivated meat is. Can you give a brief definition of cultivated, sometimes called cultured meat?
Sure. So it's separate to conventional meat. Actually, cultivated meat is actually producing the same end product, so you'll still get your actual kind of burgers and sausages and steaks and fillets. But what's really changing is that production system. So instead of producing these meats through an animal, what we can do with cultivated meat is just take a cellular sample from an animal without having to kill the animal, and then in bioreactors, similar to how we brew beer, just grow these cells into large quantities and then just kind of package them in the same way to give it the same product. And really the benefits there are that it eliminates much of the environmental and ethical harm that the conventional meat industry is creating right now, and really provides a sustainable way of feeding the future.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about why cultivated meat is a sustainable alternative to some of the traditional ways that we've produced meat?
Not many people know, but kind of livestock or conventional agriculture is really damaging for the environment, and actually produces more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation sector and uses 50% of all our antibiotics. And that's not to mention the fact that obviously there are kind of large areas of rainforest that are being cut down to support livestock. And then if you're looking at kind of fish, then you have microplastic contamination, heavy metals and overfishing that again are not only damaging to the environment, but also to the people eating those foods. And what cultivated meat can do is kind of produce these meats in a very clean and efficient environment. So within bioreactors, you're only producing the meat that you actually will then eat, and you're feeding them the exact nutrients and supporting that growth environment, and creating that growth environment exactly how they like to be grown. So there's very little waste there, and since it's an enclosed loop system, you don't need to use any antibiotics for that. And what's great then is, since then producing kind of batches, it's very easy to, if there is a problem with a batch, it's very easy to kind of take one batch out, as opposed to a whole farm where if there's a disease that spreads through that farm, then kind of many years of meat could then be put to waste.
So you make cultivated meat sound very compelling, but there are still some challenges, both financially and technically, to making this at scale. So can you talk about what some of those challenges are and why we haven't seen this in the grocery stores just yet?
Sure. So this is actually a question we were asking ourselves just over 1.5 years ago. And what we kept seeing again and again was really the big bottleneck that's preventing or holding back this industry and preventing it from commercializing is the cost of production, or more specifically, the cost of the growth media, which like conventional meat, takes up more than 80% of production costs. And right now, the current solutions are more kind of tailored to pharmaceutical products. And really, there isn't a solution that not only uses animal-free components, but is able to reach the performance, scale, and cost requirements of the cultivated meat industry.
And that's in part because of one particular nutrient, right? I think that's the fetal bovine, or sometimes called fetal calf serum, right? And this is what you guys at Multus Media are working to replace. Can you talk a little bit about how you're going to make the cultivated meat experience completely animal-free? Yeah,
so just to touch on FBS, or fetal bovine serum, this is a serum that's derived from animal blood, and is used conventionally in biomedical research or biopharmaceutical production to grow mammalian cells. And the reason it's used is because it contains this concoction of proteins and salts and other nutrients there that really kind of mimic the growth environment that we see in young animals. And in that sense, it's very good at growing cells. But obviously, you see the downside of that is it's an unethical byproduct of the livestock industry. It's not very scalable, and you also have some batch-to-batch variability that really isn't good when you're trying to produce a consistent product at scale. So what we're doing is taking these components that exist within FBS, or these animal sera, and trying to produce them without animals. So looking at yeast as a production system, similar to how, again, beer is brewed with just growing yeast in large bioreactors to produce specific proteins, and then formulating them or bringing them together in a way that mimics this similar growth environment but in a way that can be scaled and doesn't use animal components.
I see. So from end to end, the entire cultivated meat process will now be animal free because you're sourcing things from recombinant or microbial sources, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Now, you'd mentioned that FBS is quite a complex mixture, and I imagine that in addition to proteins, there might even be some carbohydrate or lipid components that help to promote the cell growth. How did your team decide which of those components were going to be the best and most efficient to include in your first product, Proliferum M?
Sure. So what we've done is taken FBS as a first focus and really analyzed which components are in that, but also looked at other serum-free growth media that have been developed for the pharmaceutical industry to see what nutrients they use as well. And then what we're doing is kind of taking a very broad stroke approach, looking at all these ingredients and then taking a statistical or data-driven approach then to find out which ingredients are kind of very useful in growth, and then which proportions that they work best together.
You mentioned that there's already some serum-free media that's available. How will the media that you're producing be superior to that?
Sure. So what's the challenge there in these conventional media that exist already is that they've been designed in a way that they're very specific to their use case, and they use highly pure individual ingredients that are then brought together. And this makes not only the medium not very useful if you're looking at growing a number of different cell types, but also very expensive. So what we're doing in the first case then is using components that are more food grade or food safe, and looking particularly at yeast as a way of providing this extra nutrient. So if we use yeast then to produce our proteins, that byproduct of yeast can actually be broken down itself as an additional nutrient source that offsets a lot of these costs. And then the other thing is what we're doing is optimizing this formulation so that it can grow, so that it can give high performance across a number of different variants within mammalian cells, for example. So that then offers that element of universality as well as kind of food grade and low cost.
So that's a question that I had as well. The bovine nature would be great for growing beef, but what about other types of meat products like lamb or goat? Would Proliferum M, I believe the M stands for mammalian, so it's good for mammalian tissue culture. Would this be ideal for all types of mammal-derived meat products, or will you be able to tailor those to the more specific cell types?
Yeah, our target initially is to create this kind of universal serum for mammalian cells. So again, looking at variants not only within bovine cells, but also kind of lamb, goat, and porcine cells as well. But then what we can do is kind of take a step further and look specifically at either individual cell lines that company might be using within the bovine sphere, or then just look at bovine as a kind of a group itself, and then further tailor our media for these specific use cases.
And do you plan to create media that will work for other types of cells? I'm thinking chicken or turkey or, fish, other types of products that people are developing in the cultivated meat space?
Absolutely. So we're taking mammalian cells as a first focus, but our products then after that, we'll be expanding to look at avian cells. So that should cover chicken and duck as well. And then also different types of seafood, which are a bit more unknown, but definitely we're looking towards developing products for those different types and seeing where actually we can really innovate in looking at novel proteins in an area that really hasn't been researched much before in the biomedical sphere. And that's where it's really interesting to us to have this ability to identify the key components for growth media and bring them together in a way that supports sufficient cell growth.
Currently, you're working with naturally derived proteins, or proteins as they would be expressed from yeast, but in their natural sequence. How will you incorporate perhaps protein engineering to improve the performance of some of those going forward?
Some of these proteins really make much of the cost of growth media as we know it, specifically proteins called growth factors. Although they're not consumed by the cells themselves, they do break down naturally and have some kind of performance issues that may not be applicable at large scale. So what we're doing with our protein engineering is taking these natural proteins and just changing a few kind of amino acids within their sequence to enhance their performance characteristics. And really that will benefit the cultivated meat industry by effectively increasing the performance of the whole growth media, which then as a result will reduce the amount of growth factor or expensive growth factor component that you'd need in the final formulation.
Well, that will be really exciting when you have a media that even exceeds the performance of FBS. Now, you mentioned that your team came together about a year and a half ago. Can you talk about your co-founders, Kevin and Reka, and how you guys decided this was a good problem for you to solve?
Yeah, so we all actually met through the Synthetic Biology Society at Imperial College, and really started as a project where Kevin brought this idea of cultivated meat being this great new technology that's combining biotechnology and food and sustainability. But the question that we couldn't answer was why we couldn't buy that yet, and what are the key challenges in the way of commercializing this product. So there we got excited about growth media in particular, and saw that as not a kind of a huge scientific gap in understanding, but more of an engineering challenge where we'd be taking existing technologies, applying new modern techniques, and actually kind of innovating in a new industry that can break away from some of the stricter regulation of the pharmaceutical industry and find new ways of innovating in cell biology.
Oh, that's very exciting. So now I want to take a trip 5 years in the future, all right? So you've graduated from IndieBio and Proliferum M is on the shelves and being used. How do you see Multus Media's products having evolved, and how do you see the sector of cultivated meat having changed in a 5-year window?
Yeah, so 5 years is kind of this big number that a lot of companies are saying the cultivated meat will really start to make an impact on the traditional meat industry and be available to kind of mass amounts of people. So that really is a key goal for us, to be in a position where we can service the whole industry and look at how we can start increasing scale and managing different products across different cell lines. So we'll be looking at proliferum, so as a serum replacement for cell growth, but also different sera for different parts of the production process. So turning these stem cells that you may have grown up with proliferum M, but then using different types of serum to differentiate those stem cells into muscles, fats, connective tissue. And in that case, have a product that we can not only allow this whole industry to commercialize at a profitable price point, but then also support new startups coming into the space by offering a solution that is low cost, animal free, and allows them to focus on new technologies that can support this industry into the future.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. And you touched on how there are different cell types that might be involved in the cultivated meat space. And I imagine that this would be one differentiation from plant-derived meat alternatives, where you might get the actual experience of a fish fillet or a beef steak in the future once people are able to develop these technologies. Can you talk a little bit more about how, let's say, the cultivated meat space differentiates from some of the plant-derived alternatives?
Sure. So right now, the plant-based space is kind of restricted to kind of more kind of burger type or sausage type meats. And these do a fairly good job of replicating that meat experience with taste and smell and sound. But actually, the one downfall there is the nutritional value. But what cultivated meat can do, since it's actually producing real meat and real fats from animals, what we can do there is not only further replicate or go beyond the experience of meat, but look at more structured meat types, such as you said, the steaks and fillets, that can be customized in a way where we can define where we want the muscle cells, the fat cells, and in that sense, or even combine different animals if you wanted to, so we could have a salmon fat with a beef muscle, and I think that could be really interesting.
Have you, Kai, had the opportunity to try some of this cultivated meat and see how closely it replicates the experience of natural meats?
I personally haven't, and it's something I really want to do. I've tried the plant-based alternatives and thought they were pretty good, but there's still some way to go. But I'm hoping to, in the next year or so, kind of talk to some of our customers and try and get a tasting.
Wonderful. Well, you'll have to report back and let us know how those tastes and replicate that experience. I can see that you're quite busy. You're in the lab there. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking time to speak with me today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.